The sun hammered down on Dusty Hollow like a blacksmith shaping hot iron against an anvil. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the heat did not merely exist, it possessed weight. It pressed against the wooden slats of the storefronts and settled heavily into the red dirt of Main Street, kicking up in choking clouds every time a horse trotted past. Eliza Hart shifted the weight of the water bucket to her left hand, the handle digging into her palm. She took a breath, grit coating her tongue, and prepared for the next step. Step with the left, smooth, strong. Drag with the right, short, sharp. Her hip dipped, her shoulder jerked to compensate, and the water in the bucket sloshed, splashing onto the hem of her calico dress. The dust on the fabric turned instantly to red mud. From the shaded porch of the Silver Dollar Saloon, the sound of a banjo plucked lazily at the thick air. A group of cattle hands lounged there, their hats pulled low. They stopped talking as she passed. Eliza did not look at them, but she felt their eyes. She knew exactly what they saw. They did not see a woman of 24 years with eyes the color of hickory nuts and a mind that had once devoured Shakespeare and Plato. They saw the rhythm, the dip, the hitch. They saw the defect. Afternoon. "Miss Eliza," one of them called out. It was a polite greeting, wrapped in pity so thick it tasted like spoiled milk. "Good afternoon, Mr. Taggart," she replied, keeping her chin level with the horizon. She did not stop. If she stopped, starting again would be harder. The pain in her right leg was a dull, rusted wire running from her ankle to her hip, a sensation she had lived with for 8 years. 8 years since the world had ended and begun again. It had happened in Pennsylvania, in a green pasture that seemed a lifetime away from this red hell. She had been 16. Luke, her brother, had been 10. The horse was a spooked stallion, rearing up with hooves flashing like iron hammers. Luke had frozen in the shadow of the beast. Eliza had not. She had moved with the grace she used to possess, a fluid launch of her body to shove her brother to safety. She had saved the boy. She had not saved herself. The bone had snapped with a sound like a pistol shot. The doctor in that small town had been drunk or incompetent, or perhaps just indifferent to the agony of a girl. He had set the bone crooked. It healed that way, knitting together into a twisted map of failure. The school board had told her, with grave faces, that a teacher must command respect, and a woman who hobbled distracted the children. They said it was for her own good, so they moved west. Everyone moved west when they had something to hide or something to lose. She and Luke had come to the Texas territory, to this edge of the map called Dusty Hollow. Eliza reached the back entrance of Mrs. Gable's boarding house. She set the bucket down and leaned against the doorframe, exhaling a shuddering breath. She wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She was a seamstress by trade, a maid by necessity, and a burden by reputation. "Eliza, is that you, Mrs.?" Gable's voice came from the kitchen. "Yes, ma'am. I have the water. Hurry and wash up. Child, Thomas is coming at 6 o'clock. You cannot go to the Briggs estate looking like a field hand." Eliza looked down at her dusty boots. One sole was built up an inch higher than the other, a clumsy attempt by the local cobbler to even out her gait. It helped, but not enough. "I will be ready," Eliza whispered to the empty yard. The dining room of the Harlan Briggs estate was a fortress against the wildness outside. Thick velvet curtains held back the night, and crystal oil lamps cast a golden, unwavering light over the table. The air smelled of roast beef, cigar smoke, and money. Eliza sat at the center of the long table, her hands folded demurely in her lap. She was wearing her best dress, a navy blue silk she had remade from an old gown of her mother's. She had sewn extra pleats into the skirt on the right side to obscure the line of her hip when she sat. Beside her sat Thomas Avery. He was 30 years old, with hair the color of wheat and a smile that had charmed half the unmarried women in the county. He was Harlan Briggs's adopted son and business partner. He was safe, he was respectable, and for reasons Eliza still struggled to parse, he had chosen her. "The expansion is inevitable," Harlan Briggs declared from the head of the table. He was a massive man, built like a bull, with a neck that spilled over his starch-stiffened collar. He sliced his meat with a violent precision. "The Union Pacific investors are watching us. If we can secure the northern pass, Dusty Hollow becomes the hub for 300 miles. 300 miles of commerce," Thomas echoed, raising his wine glass. He looked at Eliza, his eyes crinkling. "Imagine that. Eliza, civilization, right here at our doorstep." Eliza forced a smile. Her leg was throbbing beneath the table, a rhythmic ache that synced with her heartbeat. "It sounds very ambitious, Mr. Briggs." "It is not ambition, my dear. It is destiny." Briggs grunted. He chewed heavily. "But destiny has obstacles. The surveys show the only viable grade for the track runs straight through the Red Rock Canyons." Eliza stiffened. "The Red Rock Canyons, but that is where the Comanche winter camps are. The treaties designate that land as hunting grounds." The table went silent. The other guests, the banker, the mayor, and Captain Reynolds from the nearby fort, looked at her with mild surprise. Women in Dusty Hollow were expected to discuss recipes and church socials, not treaties and geography. Briggs wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. His eyes were cold chips of flint. "Treaties are written in ink, Miss Hart. Progress is written in steel. Those savages do not use the land. They wander it like stray dogs. We intend to build something permanent. They have lived there for generations," Eliza said, her voice quiet but steady. She felt Thomas's hand touch her knee under the table. It was a warning squeeze. "I read in the Gazette that the government promised—" "The government is in Washington." Briggs cut her off, his voice booming. "We are in Texas, and I will not let a pack of Stone Age heathens stop the flow of millions of dollars. They are a blight. They steal cattle. They scare off investors. They need to be swept clean." "Swept clean," Captain Reynolds muttered, swirling his whiskey. He looked less certain than Briggs, but he nodded. "If they provoke us, we will have cause. And they always provoke us eventually." "Exactly," Thomas said, his voice smooth as oil. He patted Eliza's knee again. Softer this time, patronizing. "Eliza has a tender heart. Father, she saves injured birds. It is part of her charm. But she understands that men must handle the hard business of the world." Eliza looked down at her plate. The roast beef suddenly looked raw and unappealing. She wanted to say that the Comanche were people, fathers and mothers and children, not birds to be pitied or dogs to be shot. She wanted to say that land theft was theft, no matter how much steel you laid on top of it. But she said nothing. She was 24, unmarried, crippled, and dependent on her brother's meager wages and her own needlework. Thomas Avery offered a house with wooden floors, a carriage so she would not have to walk, and a life where she would never have to worry about the cost of flour. Safety. That was the bargain. She swallowed her words along with a sip of bitter wine. "To the railroad," the banker toasted. "To a clean land," Briggs growled. The dinner concluded at 9 o'clock. The air outside had cooled, but it was still dry enough to crack a lip. Thomas walked Eliza out to the wide, wraparound porch. The moon was a sliver of bone high in the sky. Thomas stopped near the steps and turned to her. He looked handsome in the moonlight, the very picture of the American dream. He took both her hands in his. "You were quiet tonight, after the toast," he said gently. "My leg was bothering me." Eliza lied. It was easier than the truth. "I am sorry," Thomas cooed. He stepped closer, his hands sliding from her fingers up to her waist. He pulled her slightly against him. It was an intimate gesture, possessive. Eliza felt a flicker of panic. She did not feel desire. She felt gratitude. She told herself. She should feel gratitude. "Mr. Briggs seems very determined about the Comanche," she said, trying to create space with words. "He is a visionary, and soon we will be part of that vision." Thomas leaned down, his face close to her ear. "I have spoken to the architect. The house we build will have ramps in the garden. You will not have to struggle." "That is very kind of you, Thomas." "I want to take care of you." "Eliza." His hand moved lower, resting on the curve of her hip, right above where the bone had shattered and fused. He squeezed. You are a handsome woman. Your face is exquisite. No one looks at your face enough. Eliza froze. When we are married, Thomas whispered, his breath smelling of brandy. We will have fine dresses made for you, long hems. If you learn to move slowly, if you hold my arm just so, no one will even notice the sway. You will look perfect. He pulled back to look her in the eyes. He was smiling, but his eyes were calculating. He was inspecting a purchase, looking for ways to hide the scratch on the finish. Just remember, he said, his voice dropping to a murmur. Walk beautifully beside me. That is all I ask. Be an ornament that does not break. He kissed her on the cheek. It was wet and brief. Good night, Eliza. Good night, Thomas. She walked down the stairs, gripping the railing until her knuckles turned white. Each step down was a jolt of pain, but the pain in her leg was nothing compared to the cold stone that had just settled in her stomach. He did not want a wife. He wanted a doll that he could prop up in the corner. He wanted to fix her, hide her, erase the part of her that was broken, which meant erasing the part of her that had survived. The walk back to the boarding house was half a mile. Eliza refused to take the carriage. She needed the pain. She needed the rhythm. Step, drag, wince. The town was quieter now. The saloon was still humming, but the respectable folk were in bed. Eliza walked past the darkened storefronts, her shadow stretching long and distorted against the dust. She reached the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open scrubland. She stopped. To the north, the hills rose up like the spines of sleeping dragons. They were dark, jagged, and terrifying. That was where the Comanche were. That was the land Briggs wanted to conquer, far up in the foothills, miles away. She saw a tiny flicker of orange light, a campfire. She stared at it. Someone was sitting by that fire, a savage. Briggs had said, a threat, but standing there, with the echo of Thomas's demand to walk beautifully ringing in her ears. Eliza felt a strange pull. The people by that fire did not care about railways or investments. They lived under the stars. They moved with the wind. I am tired of hiding, she whispered to the dark. I am so tired of being grateful. A sudden noise made her jump. Careful, Missy, the dark has teeth. Eliza spun around, nearly losing her balance. Sitting in the shadows of the livery stable's overhang was a man. He was a heap of rags and beard, smelling of stale rum and the sea a strange scent in the middle of a desert. It was Barnaby, the old sailor who had somehow drifted this far inland and never found his way back to the water. You startled me, Barnaby, Eliza said, pressing a hand to her chest. You were staring at the fires, the old man rasped. He took a swig from a brown bottle. Bad luck to stare at the fires. They look back. Mister, Briggs says they will be gone soon. The army is going to clear the hills. Barnaby laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound, like dead leaves skittering on pavement. Clear them. You cannot clear the wind, girl. You cannot shoot a shadow. He leaned forward into the sliver of moonlight. His eyes were milky with cataracts, but they seemed to see right through her. They talk about the Comanche like they are wolves, Eliza said. Some are, Barnaby whispered. He lowered his voice, as if the air itself might be listening. They say there is one up there, a ghost walker. They call him Wolf Shadow. Eliza shivered, though the night was warm. A chief, a warrior, but more than that, I heard the trappers talk. They say he was a man once, who believed in the white man's paper and the white man's God. But the paper lied, and the God was deaf. Now he only comes down when the blood pact is broken. Barnaby pointed a crooked finger toward the distant flicker on the hill. He does not fight for land, Missy. He fights for balance, and when the scales tip, Barnaby tipped his bottle upside down. A single drop fell into the dust. He comes to collect. That is just a story, Barnaby, Eliza said, adjusting her shawl. Just a legend to scare children. Maybe, the old man mumbled, settling back into the gloom. But you walk broken, girl. You walk like someone who knows what it costs to survive. The broken ones always hear the legends first. Eliza stared at him for a moment longer, then turned and hurried toward the boarding house. Her legs screamed in protest, her gait clumsy and uneven. Step, drag, wince. She climbed the stairs to her small room, undressed in the dark, and lay on her narrow bed. She closed her eyes, but sleep did not come. Behind her eyelids, she saw the crystal lamps of the Briggs estate, cold and perfect. And then she saw the tiny, wild spark of the fire in the hills. Thomas wanted her to walk beautifully. The world wanted her to be invisible. Eliza Hart lay in the dark and listened to the wind howling down from the north, wondering if the wolf's shadow was listening too. 3 days after the dinner at the Briggs estate, the wagon wheels groaned over the hard-packed earth of the trail, a sound like the complaining of old men. Eliza Hart sat on the wooden bench seat of the supply wagon, her spine stiff against the jolting impact of every rut and stone. The heat was a physical weight, pressing the air out of her lungs, but the landscape around her was vast enough to swallow her discomfort whole. Thomas and Harlan Briggs had insisted on this journey. They called it an act of charity and integration. The army outpost near the edge of the Comanche territory needed uniforms mended and new linens sewn. They suggested that Eliza, with her nimble fingers, was the perfect candidate to deliver the goods and take the measurements. Thomas had squeezed her hand and told her it would be good for her to see the frontier under the protection of the company guards, to understand the land they were going to tame. "It will toughen you up, Eliza," he had said, his smile tight. "Show the town you are not afraid of the wild." Now, looking at the endless expanse of sagebrush and red rock mesas rising like altars against the blue sky, Eliza suspected they simply wanted her out of the way while they finalized their railroad contracts. Or perhaps, a darker thought whispered in her mind, they wanted her to see exactly how dangerous the world outside of Thomas's protection could be. The wagon was escorted by 4 men on horseback. They were rough men, employed by the Briggs Cattle Company. Their leader was a man named Silas, who had a face like tanned leather and eyes that seemed to count coins whenever they looked at her. "Best keep your eyes on the ridge, Miss Hart," Silas called out, riding up alongside the wagon. He spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dust. "This is bad country, Comanche country. I was told the treaty line was 10 miles north," Eliza said, clutching the side of the wagon as it dipped into a dry wash. Silas laughed, a dry, humorless bark. "Treaty lines are imaginary. Miss, a Comanche does not care about a line on a map. They care about hair. You got nice hair. Would be a shame to see it drying on a lodgepole." The other men chuckled. They had been doing this for 20 miles, telling stories of massacres, of women dragged off into the night, of skin peeled back from skulls while the victim was still screaming. It felt rehearsed, a theatrical performance designed to terrify. Eliza adjusted her bonnet, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her tremble. She looked away from them, out toward the horizon, despite their words. She could not suppress the awe rising in her chest. The land here was violent, yes, but it was magnificent. The red earth seemed to pulse with life. Hawks circled in slow, lazy loops overhead. It was a raw, honest beauty, far removed from the velvet curtains and polite lies of the dining room in Dusty Hollow. "It is beautiful," she murmured to herself. "Deadly is what it is," the driver of the wagon muttered. He was an older man, nervous, his hands white-knuckled on the reins. "I just want to get to the fort, drop this load, and get back before sundown. I do not like the smell of the air today." The air was still, too still. The birds had stopped singing. The road dipped into a narrow canyon, the walls of red stone rising high on either side, casting long, cool shadows. It was a perfect choke point. Eliza had read enough penny dreadfuls to know that, and her stomach tightened. Then, the world exploded. It began not with a sound, but with a color, a flash of red and ochre paint on skin, bursting from the rocks above. Then came the screaming, It was a high-pitched, ululating war cry that bounced off the canyon walls, amplifying until it sounded like 100 demons were descending upon them. "Ambush, ambush!" Silas screamed. Pulling his revolver, gunfire erupted. The deafening crack of pistols and the deeper boom of rifles shattered the silence. The horses pulling the wagon shrieked in terror, rearing up in their harnesses. The driver took a bullet to the shoulder and slumped forward, losing the reins. The wagon slewed violently to the left. Eliza screamed, grabbing for the bench, but momentum was a cruel master. The front wheel struck a boulder, and the entire wagon tipped. The world spun blue sky, red rock, brown wood, and then darkness slammed into her. She hit the ground hard. The air was knocked from her lungs in a painful whoosh. For a moment, she lay in the dust, stunned, the taste of copper in her mouth. Her bad leg, the right one, throbbed with a fresh, hot agony that radiated up to her hip. "Get the girl! Get the supplies!" someone shouted. Eliza coughed, pushing herself up on her elbows. Her vision swam. The dust was thick, choking. Through the haze, she saw the Comanche attackers. There were perhaps 6 of them, rushing down the scree slope, firing wildly. They wore breechcloths, and their chests were painted with zigzag patterns of black and red. They wore feathers in their hair. But as Eliza dragged herself toward the cover of the overturned wagon, her eyes sharpened by fear caught a detail that made no sense. One of the attackers, a man screaming like a banshee, jumped over a fallen log near her. He landed heavily, on his feet. He was not wearing soft deerskin moccasins. He was wearing heavy, black leather cavalry boots with a thick heel, the kind issued to the Union soldiers, the kind sold in the general store in Dusty Hollow. Eliza blinked, trying to clear the dust from her lashes. She looked at his hand. He was gripping a Colt Navy revolver, the metal gleaming and new. He reloaded it with a practiced, mechanical efficiency that spoke of drill yards, not open plains. They are not Comanche, she realized, the thought striking her with more force than the fall. It is a performance. She looked around for the escort. Silas and his men were firing back, but they were shooting high, aiming at the rocks, missing on purpose. It was a chaotic dance, a staged massacre. "Help me!" a voice cried out. Near the front of the wagon, the driver was tangled in the reins, bleeding. Eliza's instinct, honed by years of caring for her reckless younger brother, overrode her terror. She gritted her teeth against the pain in her leg and crawled toward him. "Stay down," she hissed at the driver. "They are not who you think they are." Before the driver could answer, a shadow fell over them. The attacker with the cavalry boots loomed above Eliza. He raised his weapon, his face smeared with grease and paint, but his eyes were bright blue and familiar. He was not there to kill her, she realized. He was there to capture her, to make her the victim in Briggs's narrative. He reached down to grab her arm, and then a sound cut through the canyon. It was not a scream, it was a howl, a long, mournful, terrifying sound that raised the hair on Eliza's arms. It was the sound of a wolf, but it came from a human throat. The attacker froze. From the opposite ridge, the western side of the canyon, figures appeared. These men did not scream. They did not waste movement. They flowed over the rocks like water poured from a jar. They rode horses that seemed to be extensions of their own bodies. The real Comanche had arrived. Chaos descended. The fake attackers turned their weapons on the new threat, their staged raid suddenly turning into a desperate fight for survival. The air filled with the thick, acrid smoke of black powder. Bullets whined off the rocks like angry hornets. Eliza pressed herself into the dirt, covering her head. Through the spokes of the broken wagon wheel, she watched. A warrior on a paint horse broke through the line of the fake attackers. He was terrifying. He wore no shirt, his skin the color of polished bronze, slick with sweat. A single black handprint was painted across his chest. His hair was long and loose, flying behind him like a banner of night. He did not ride toward the wagon to loot it. He rode toward the carnage to intercede. Eliza saw a little girl, the daughter of the wagon driver, who had been hiding in the back amongst the fabric rolls, scramble out. Terrified, running blindly into the open crossfire. "No!" Eliza screamed, trying to stand up, but her leg collapsed under her. The warrior on the paint horse saw the child too. He leaned low, defying gravity, hanging off the side of his galloping horse. With one fluid motion, he scooped the child up, shielding her small body with his own as a bullet tore past his shoulder. He pulled the horse up in a spray of gravel, the animal dancing nervously. He looked around, his eyes scanning the battlefield, and then he looked at Eliza. Time seemed to stutter and stop. The noise of the gunfight faded into a dull roar. The warrior's eyes were black, deep, and intelligent. There was no savagery in them, only a fierce, focused intensity. He looked at her not as an enemy, but as a puzzle. It was him, the wolf shadow, the man from the stories. Eliza stared back, mesmerized. For a heartbeat, they were the only two people in the canyon. Then, a sharp, searing pain tore through her right calf. Eliza gasped, the sound strangled in her throat. A stray bullet had grazed the outside of her bad leg, tearing through the skirt and the flesh. The shock was immediate. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel of gray light. She slumped forward, her face pressing into the red dust. "I am going to die here," she thought, a detached, calm realization. "I am going to die in the dirt, and Thomas will use my name to build his railroad." Consciousness began to slip away, like water draining from a basin. She felt the vibrations of hooves hitting the ground near her head. A hand, rough and calloused but surprisingly gentle, gripped her shoulder. She was hauled upward, the movement jarring her injured leg so badly she cried out. "Do not sleep," a voice commanded. It was a deep voice, the English heavily accented, the vowels long and flat, like stones skipping on water. Eliza forced her eyes open. The warrior, wolf shadow, was holding her. He was impossibly strong. He held the little girl with one arm against his chest and supported Eliza with the other. The smell of him filled her nose sage, wood smoke, horse sweat, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. "If you sleep," he said, looking directly into her eyes, "you will not wake up." He did not wait for her permission. He swung her up, leveraging her body over the wither of his horse. The animal shifted, its muscles bunching beneath her. Wolf Shadow vaulted up behind her. Eliza was pressed against his chest. She could feel the rapid, powerful thud of his heart against her back. "Hold the child," he ordered, pressing the driver's daughter into Eliza's arms. Eliza clutched the weeping girl instinctively. Wolf Shadow kicked his horse, and they surged forward. They were not running away. They were vanishing. He guided the horse not down the road, but up a narrow, hidden fissure in the canyon wall that Eliza had not even seen. As the horse scrambled up the steep incline, hooves striking sparks against the stone, Eliza turned her head to look back at the ambush site below. The dust was settling. The Comanche attackers were retreating, realized they were outmatched. One of them, the man in the cavalry boots, had ripped the bandana from his face to wipe the sweat from his eyes. He looked up, watching his prize escape. Eliza's breath hitched. She knew that face. It was not a stranger. It was Dutch, the foreman of the Briggs Ranch, the man who had held the door open for her when she arrived for dinner 3 nights ago, the man who worked directly for Harlan Briggs. The realization hit her harder than the bullet. There were no savages down there, only men with payrolls. It was them," she whispered, her voice slurring as the blood loss began to take its toll. "It was lie." "Hold on," Wolf Shadow growled in her ear. They crested the ridge and plunged into the labyrinth of the high country. The horse moved with a terrifying speed, leaping over crevices and sliding down shale slopes. Eliza felt every impact in her shattered bone. The pain was a white-hot fire consuming her leg. She tried to stay awake. She tried to tell him that she was not an enemy, that she knew the truth now. But the rhythm of the gallop was hypnotic. Step, drag, wince, gallop, breath, heartbeat. The world blurred. The red rocks turned to gray, then to black. The last thing Eliza felt was the arm of the Comanche warrior tightening around her waist, an iron band keeping her from falling into the void. Then she surrendered to the dark. Consciousness returned to Eliza not as a flood, but as a slow, rhythmic tide. First came the sound of water trickling over stones, a gentle and persistent music that felt entirely out of place after the chaos of the ambush. Then came the smell, pungent and earthy burning sage, cedar smoke, and the rich, savory scent of roasting venison. She opened her eyes. Above her, filtered sunlight streamed through the smoke hole of a hide lodge, painting the interior in warm hues of amber and gold. She lay on a bed of furs that was softer than any mattress she had slept on in Mrs. Gable's boarding house. She tried to sit up, and the memory of the bullet slammed into her. A sharp, hot ache radiated from her right calf. She gasped, her hand flying to the wound. "Be still," a voice said. It was a woman's voice, cracked with age but soothing, like dry leaves rustling together. Eliza turned her head. Sitting beside her, grinding dried leaves in a stone bowl, was an elderly Comanche woman. Her face was a map of deep lines etched by wind and sun. Her hair, a striking silver braided with strips of leather. This was Ashen Dove. "The bullet passed through," Ashen Dove said, her English halting but clear. She applied a cool, green paste to the wound, and the burning sensation instantly subsided into a dull throb. "It did not touch the bone. You were lucky. Or perhaps the spirits pushed it aside." "Where am I?" Eliza asked, her voice raspy. She looked around. The lodge was spacious, filled with woven baskets and hanging herbs. "You are where the bluecoats cannot find you," Ashen Dove replied. She wiped her hands on a cloth. "You are safe." Eliza pushed herself up on her elbows, panic fluttering in her chest. "The little girl, the driver's daughter, is she?" "She is outside. She plays with the dogs. Children forget fear quickly when they are fed." Eliza sank back, relief washing over her, but then the reality of her situation set in. She was a captive, a prisoner of the very people she had been told were monsters. "Why?" Eliza whispered. "Why did you take us?" The flap of the lodge was pushed aside, and a shadow fell across the firs. Wolf Shadow entered. He looked different than he had in the canyon. The war paint was gone, revealing a face of striking, angular planes, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that were obsidian dark. He wore a simple buckskin shirt and leggings. He did not look like a demon. He looked like a man who carried the weight of a mountain on his shoulders. He stood near the entrance, his posture relaxed but alert. "If we had left you there," Wolf Shadow said, his deep voice filling the small space, "your own people would have killed you." Eliza frowned. "That is insane. They were coming to help." "They were coming to finish a story," Wolf Shadow corrected her. He crossed his arms. "The story of the savage Comanche who slaughtered a wagon train. They needed bodies to prove the story true. A dead woman and a dead child make better headlines than living witnesses." Eliza opened her mouth to argue, but the image of Dutch, the foreman, wiping the sweat from his face with his cavalry boots on, flashed in her mind. She remembered the staged way they had fired their guns. She remembered the lack of shock in Silas's eyes. She closed her mouth. The truth was a cold stone in her stomach. "You are guests here," Wolf Shadow said, watching her reaction closely. "Not prisoners, but you cannot leave, not yet. The soldiers are combing the hills. If they find you, they will silence you." With that, he turned and ducked back out into the sunlight. 2 days later, Eliza was strong enough to hobble to the entrance of the lodge. She leaned against the support pole, blinking in the bright afternoon light. The camp was nestled in a hidden box canyon, surrounded by sheer red cliffs that protected it from the wind and prying eyes. It was nothing like the chaotic, violent den of thieves Briggs had described at his dinner table. It was a village. She saw women sitting in circles, laughing as they scraped hides or sewed moccasins with intricate beadwork. She saw men tending to horses, speaking to the animals with low, gentle murmurs. She saw children, Comanche children, and the little white girl, Sarah, running through the tall grass, chasing a scruffy dog. There was no cruelty here. There was industry, community, and a sense of peace that Dusty Hollow. with all its straight lines and rigid rules, completely lacked. Eliza watched a young mother nursing an infant near a fire. The woman looked up, saw Eliza, and offered a shy, tentative smile. Eliza felt a crack in the foundation of her worldview. She had been a teacher. She had taught history from books written by men in Washington and New York. Those books spoke of manifest destiny and inevitable progress, of bringing light to the darkness. But standing here, watching the sunlight play on the canyon walls and listening to the laughter of children, she wondered who truly held the light. She felt a presence beside her. Wolf's shadow was leaning against a rock nearby, whittling a piece of ash wood. He did not look up, but she knew he was aware of her every breath. "You look confused," he said. "I am," Eliza admitted. She shifted her weight off her bad leg. This is not what they say it is. Fear paints ugly pictures," Wolf's shadow said. He blew the shavings off the wood. He looked up at her then. "In the canyon, when the shooting started, you did not hide. You crawled toward the driver. You tried to help the soldier." Eliza looked down at her hands. "He was hurt. He was one of the men who led you into a trap. I did not know that then, and even if I had—" She paused, looking for the words. "I was a teacher once, before I came west. I taught children to read and to be kind. I cannot turn off the part of me that values life just because the person holding it is flawed. To watch a man die like an animal, without comfort, I could not do it." Wolf's shadow studied her. His gaze was intense, stripping away her defenses. For the first time, Eliza saw something soften in his eyes. It was not pity. It was recognition. "You have a warrior's heart," he said quietly. "It is a rare thing in a world of traitors." He stood up and walked away, leaving Eliza leaning against the pole, her heart beating a strange, erratic rhythm against her ribs. Night fell over the canyon like a heavy velvet blanket. The air grew cool, and the fires burned brighter, casting dancing shadows against the rock walls. Eliza sat by the fire outside Ashen Dove's lodge. The pain in her leg was worse at night. The muscles cramped, and the old break ached with a deep, bone-weary throbbing. She needed to move. If she did not move, the joint would seize up, and she would be unable to walk in the morning. She grabbed the sturdy branch Ashen Dove had given her to use as a cane. Gritting her teeth, she pushed herself upright. She began to pace the perimeter of the firelight. Step, drag, wince. It was an ugly rhythm. In the flickering light, her shadow stretched out long and distorted, emphasizing the lurch of her hip, the heavy dragging of her right foot. She felt exposed. In the town, she wore long skirts with extra pleats to hide the defect. Here, her dress was torn and dirty, and there was nowhere to hide. She felt eyes on her. Wolf's shadow was sitting on a log on the other side of the fire, repairing a bridle. He was watching her, not with the leering curiosity of the men in the saloon, nor with the cold calculation of Thomas Avery. He was simply watching. Eliza stumbled. Her cane slipped on a loose stone, and she lurched forward, barely catching herself before she fell into the dirt. The clumsiness burned her face hotter than the fire. She straightened up, tears of humiliation stinging her eyes. She hated this. She hated being broken. She hated that this strong, whole man was witnessing her struggle. "Stop staring," she snapped, the words bursting out of her before she could check them. Wolf's shadow set the bridle down. "I am watching a woman walk. Is that a crime in your world? You are watching a cripple struggle," Eliza retorted bitterly. She leaned heavily on the cane, her knuckles white. "Do not pretend otherwise. I see it in your eyes. It is what everyone sees." She gestured violently at her leg. "I limp when I walk," she said, her voice shaking with years of accumulated shame. "That is what they see first. That is all they see. They see the broken bone, and they think the mind is broken too. They think the woman is half a woman." The silence that followed was heavy. The only sound was the popping of the cedar wood in the fire. Wolf's shadow stood up. He moved around the fire, coming toward her. He moved with a predator's grace, silent and sure. He stopped only 2 feet away from her. He was tall, looming over her, but he did not feel threatening. He felt solid. He looked down at her. His eyes traveled slowly from the dusty hem of her skirt, up the line of her crooked stance, over her heaving chest, and finally locked onto her eyes. There was no pity in that gaze. There was heat. There was a raw, masculine appraisal that made Eliza's breath hitch in her throat. "I do not see a cripple," he said. His voice was low, a rough rumble that vibrated in the air between them. He took a step closer. The scent of him, leather and smoke, enveloped her. "I see a woman who walked out of a canyon with a bullet in her leg and a child in her arms." He continued, "I see a woman who stood up to a gunfight with nothing but a teacher's courage." He reached out and gently touched her shoulder. His hand was warm, his fingers calloused but incredibly gentle. "Speed is for horses," he murmured. "I need a partner, not a racer." The words hung in the air, shimmering. "I need a partner, not a racer." Eliza stared at him, stunned. Thomas had wanted an ornament. He had wanted her to walk beautifully so he would look good. Wolf Shadow did not care how she walked. He cared that she kept moving. He was offering her a place not behind him, or on a pedestal, but beside him. A flush rose from her neck to her cheeks, but it was not shame this time. It was something else, something dangerous and thrilling. Wolf Shadow's hand slid from her shoulder to her upper arm, his thumb grazing the soft skin there. The touch was electric. Eliza felt her knees weaken, not from the injury, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that he found her desirable, broken leg and all. "You should sleep," he said softly, stepping back, breaking the spell but leaving the tension humming in the air. "Tomorrow, we walk the rocks. You need to learn the ground." Eliza nodded, unable to speak. She watched him walk away into the darkness, and for the first time in 8 years, she did not feel like a broken thing. She felt like a woman standing in the firelight. The next 3 days were a grueling education. True to his word, Wolf Shadow took Eliza out of the camp and into the rocky terrain of the Box Canyon. "The ground here is not flat like your town streets," he told her on the first morning. "It changes. You must listen to it with your feet." He did not coddle her. He did not carry her. He made her walk. But he was there, a constant, steady presence at her side. "Lean into the stone," he instructed as they navigated a field of loose scree. "Use your good leg to anchor. Let the other one follow the slide." Eliza struggled. She slipped. She swore unladylike words she had learned from her brother. But every time she faltered, Wolf Shadow was there. His hand would shoot out to steady her, gripping her waist firmly. It was a practical touch, necessary to keep her upright, but every contact sent a jolt through her. She became hyper-aware of his body, the shift of muscles under his buckskin shirt, the warmth of his breath when he leaned in to correct her posture. "Don't fight the imbalance," he murmured, standing directly behind her as she tried to step over a fallen log. He placed his hands on her hips, guiding her weight distribution. "Your body has a new center. Find it. Do not try to be who you were before the horse fell. Be who you are now." Eliza closed her eyes, focusing on the sensation of his large hands on her waist. "It is hard," she whispered. "I spent so long trying to hide it." "There is no hiding here," he said, his breath stirring the hair at the nape of her neck. "The mountain does not care if you are pretty. It cares if you are strong." They sat on a flat rock overlooking the valley to rest. They shared a canteen of water, the metal warm from the sun. "Why were you a teacher?" Wolf Shadow asked, watching a hawk circle below them. "I loved books," Eliza said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "I loved the idea that words could take you places you could never go. And after the accident, it was the only thing I could do. No man wanted a wife who could not dance or work the fields. My family, they did not know what to do with me. I was a burden, an embarrassment, so I taught until the school board decided my limp was distracting." She laughed bitterly. "And then my brother and I came west, because the west is where the unwanted things go." Wolf Shadow took a sip of water. "We are not so different." Eliza Hart. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded strange and beautiful on his tongue. "I was a peace chief's son," he said, looking out at the horizon. "I believed the white soldiers when they came with papers. I told my people to sign. I told them we could live side by side. I thought I was wise." His hand tightened on the canteen. "Then the soldiers got drunk one night. They crossed the line. They burned the winter village. My wife, my child. They did not make it out of the lodge." Eliza gasped softly. She reached out and covered his hand with hers. He did not pull away. "I was not a warrior then," he said, his voice flat and hard as iron. "I was a diplomat. I was a fool. Now, I am what they made me. I am the shadow that bites back. I am an outcast among my own people too. Sometimes, the old chiefs think I am too angry. The young ones think I am too cautious." "You are not a fool," Eliza said firmly. "You believed in honor. That is not a sin. The sin belongs to those who broke the promise." Wolf Shadow turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers. His palm was rough, calloused from reins and bowstrings. Her hand looked small and pale against his. "We are both limping," he said softly. "You in your body, me in my spirit. Maybe that is why the spirits brought you to this canyon." They sat there for a long time, holding hands in the silence of the high desert. Two broken pieces of the world finding that they fit together. From the entrance of her lodge, Ashen Dove watched them return to camp as the sun began to dip below the rim of the canyon. She saw the way Eliza walked, still limping. Yes, but with her head up, her eyes bright. She saw the way Wolf Shadow matched his pace to hers, shortening his long stride so they moved in tandem. She saw the way their shoulders brushed, a casual intimacy that spoke volumes. The old woman smiled, revealing teeth worn down by years of chewing leather. She went back to her grinding bowl. Fire and dry grass. She muttered to the spirits of the lodge. "A dangerous combination, but it is the only way to clear the dead wood and let the green grow again." She knew what was coming. The soldiers were getting closer. The war was knocking at the canyon walls. But for now, in the heart of the storm, something new was taking root, something stronger than hate and more enduring than fear. Eliza Hart had stopped trying to run the race she could never win. She had found a partner, and that, Ashen Dove knew, was the most dangerous thing of all for a man like Harlan Briggs. Because a woman who knows her own worth is a weapon that cannot be uncocked. The descent from the high country was a journey of silence. The air grew heavier with every mile they traveled south, losing the crisp, pine-scented purity of the canyon and taking on the stale, dusty taste of the plains. Eliza rode behind Wolf Shadow, her arms wrapped around his waist. It was no longer an act of desperate survival, but a conscious choice of proximity. She could feel the muscles of his back shift with the movement of the horse, a living wall between her and the world she was returning to. She had argued with him for an hour that morning. She had insisted that Luke, her brother, would be frantic. She had argued that someone had to tell the truth about the men in the cavalry boots. Wolf Shadow had listened, his face impassive, and finally nodded. He respected her will, even if he doubted her world. They stopped at the ridge overlooking Dusty Hollow. It was late afternoon, and the town looked like a scar on the earth, a collection of brown boxes huddled against the vastness of the prairie. Wolf Shadow dismounted and helped her down. His hands lingered on her waist for a moment longer than necessary to steady her. "You are walking back into a cage, Eliza Hart," he said, his voice low. "I have to," Eliza replied, smoothing down the rough buckskin skirt Ashen Dove had given her. She looked at him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "If I do not speak, Briggs wins. He turns a lie into a war." "They will not hear you," Wolf Shadow warned. "Their ears are tuned to the sound of gold and fear. The truth is a quiet thing." "Then I will shout it," she said. He looked at her, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath hitch. He reached out, his hand enveloping hers. It was a rough hand, scarred and calloused, but it held hers with a reverence that Thomas Avery had never shown. The distance between them vanished. She could smell the wood smoke in his hair and the scent of leather heated by the sun. "If the cage becomes too small," he murmured, stepping closer until the toes of his moccasins touched the tip of her boots. "Remember the way to the canyon." "I will not forget," she whispered. He did not kiss her. Not yet. But the air between them crackled with the promise of it. A tension so thick it felt like a physical touch. He squeezed her hand once, hard, and then vaulted onto his horse. He did not look back as he rode into the tree line, vanishing as if he were made of the landscape itself. Eliza stood alone on the ridge. She took a deep breath, adjusted her grip on her walking stick, and turned toward the town. Step, drag, wince. She walked into Dusty Hollow not as a victim, but as a woman carrying a storm. Her arrival on Main Street stopped the town cold. The blacksmith dropped his hammer. The piano in the saloon fell silent. A woman sweeping her porch froze, her broom suspended in midair. Eliza walked down the center of the street, the dust puffing around her uneven gait. She was sunburned. Her hair was a tangled braid over her shoulder, and she was wearing Comanche leathers instead of her blue silk. "Eliza!" The scream came from the general store. Luke, her brother, burst out the door, knocking over a barrel of apples. He ran to her, his face pale and streaked with tears. He nearly tackled her in a hug, sobbing into her shoulder. "I thought you were dead," he choked out. They said they found the wagon. They said everyone was dead." "I'm alive. Luke," she said, stroking his hair. "I am safe." A crowd began to gather. It was a circle of faces. She knew the baker, the sheriff, Mrs. Gable. But their expressions were not just relieved. They were hungry. They were looking at her clothes, at her wild hair, searching for signs of the horror they imagined she had endured. "Make way, make way." The crowd parted like the Red Sea, and Harlan Briggs strode through. He was flanked by Thomas Avery. Briggs looked shocking in his relief, a performance perfectly calibrated for the audience. "My dear girl," Briggs boomed, rushing forward but stopping just short of touching her, as if she were contagious. "A miracle we had given up hope. To think, snatched by those savages, dragged into their hell." He turned to the crowd, his voice dropping to a somber baritone. "We can only imagine the unspeakable things she has suffered, a white woman, alone among beasts." Thomas stood behind his father. His face was pale, his eyes wide. He looked at Eliza's buckskin skirt, then at her face. He did not look relieved. He looked horrified. "I was not snatched," Eliza said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the murmurs like a knife. She pulled away from Luke and stood straight, balancing her weight on her good leg. She looked directly at Briggs. "The Comanche saved me," she declared. A gasp rippled through the crowd. "Saved you?" Briggs laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "The sun has addled your wits. Child, we saw the wagon, arrows, war paint." "I saw the boots," Eliza said, raising her voice. "The men who attacked us wore paint, yes, but they also wore Union cavalry boots. They reloaded Navy revolvers with the speed of drilled soldiers. And when the real Comanche arrived, your foreman, Dutch, was the one leading the attackers." The silence that fell over Main Street was absolute. Briggs's face turned a dangerous shade of purple. "You are accusing a respected man of my company," Briggs growled, stepping closer, his bulk looming over her. "You are hysterical. It is well known that captives of the Comanche are broken, brainwashed. They feed you drugs. Do they not twist your mind to turn against your own kind?" He turned to the crowd, spreading his hands. "Look at her, dressed in skins. Defending the monsters who killed our driver. The trauma has unhinged her." "I am not unhinged," Eliza shouted. "I am telling you the truth. The Comanche protected me and the little girl. They did not harm us. Not once." "And where is the girl?" someone shouted from the back. "She is safe with them," Eliza said. "Because if she came back here, she would be a witness, just like me." Thomas stepped forward then. He looked pained, as if he were the one suffering. "Eliza, please," he said, his voice thin. "Stop this. You are humiliating yourself. Come indoors. We will get the doctor. We will get you cleaned up." he said, cleaned up, the way one might talk about scraping manure off a boot. I do not need a doctor. Thomas, Eliza said, looking him in the eye. I need you to listen. But she saw it in his eyes. He was not listening. He was calculating the damage to his reputation. The town was already murmuring, the tide turning against her. It was easier to believe that a woman was mad than to believe the richest man in town was a murderer. Take her to the boarding house, Briggs ordered the sheriff. Keep her there, for her own safety. She is obviously not herself. 2 hours later, Eliza sat in Mrs. Gable's parlor. She had refused to change out of her buckskins until Thomas arrived. She wanted him to see her as she was. When Thomas entered, he did not sit. He stood by the fireplace, adjusting his cuffs. He refused to look at her directly. Father is furious, Thomas began, accusing Dutch. It was a madness. Eliza, Dutch has been with the company for 10 years. Dutch led the attack. Thomas, I saw his face. You saw what you wanted to see in a panic, Thomas snapped. He finally looked at her, his lip curling. And look at you. You look like a squaw. I look like a survivor, Eliza said coldly. Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. I had big plans for us. Eliza, the railroad contract is weeks away. I needed a partner who could host dinners, who could charm investors, a wife who represented the best of civilization. He gestured vaguely at her leg, then at her clothes. I cannot marry a woman who has lived in a teepee. Eliza, people talk. They will say you are soiled. They will wonder whose bed you warmed to stay alive. Eliza felt a cold rage settle in her chest, freezing the tears that had threatened to fall. Is that what you think, that I traded my body for safety? It does not matter what I think, Thomas said, turning his back to her. It matters what the voters think. It matters what the church thinks. And besides, he glanced at a reflection in the mirror. I need a wife who can walk down the aisle without stumbling. I need someone whole, not someone who drags a scandal behind her like a bad leg. The words hung in the air, cruel and final. Eliza stood up. She grabbed her stick. She walked over to him, the thump drag of her step loud on the wooden floor. You are right, Thomas, she said. You do need someone whole, because you are only half a man. She pulled the engagement ring from her finger, a modest garnet set in silver, and dropped it onto the mantelpiece. It made a sharp clink. Get out, she said. Thomas stiffened, adjusted his collar, and walked out without a word. Eliza waited until the door clicked shut before she sank into the armchair, her hands shaking. She was alone. The town thought she was mad. Her fiancé had discarded her, but for the first time in her life, she felt entirely clean. That evening, the heat refused to break. Eliza could not stay in the boarding house. The walls felt like they were closing in. She knew she was being watched. The sheriff had posted a deputy across the street, but she needed air. She slipped out the back door, moving through the alleyways she knew by heart. She intended to go to the small chapel at the edge of town to pray, or perhaps just to think. But as she passed the rear of the saloon, voices drifted out from an open window on the second floor. It was Briggs's private office. 500 troops. Captain, that is what I need. Briggs's voice was unmistakable. Eliza pressed herself against the rough wood of the building, holding her breath. 500 is a regiment. Harlan? Another voice replied. Captain Reynolds. I cannot deploy that kind of force based on the ramblings of a traumatized girl. The girl is irrelevant, Briggs said dismissively. I have the evidence you need. My scouts found a stash of Army rifles in a ravine near the Red Rock Canyon, stolen from your supply train last month. The Comanche are stockpiling weapons. Captain, they are preparing for war. If we do not strike first, Dusty Hollow will burn. Eliza clamped a hand over her mouth. It was a lie, another fabrication. If they have rifles. Reynolds sounded hesitant, his duty warring with his conscience. They do, Briggs insisted. We move at dawn. 3 days from now, we surround the Box Canyon. No surrender. We wipe the nest clean. Think of it, Reynolds. You will be the hero who secured the territory for the Union Pacific. A promotion, A pension. There was the sound of glass clinking against a bottle. Dawn. 3 days, Reynolds said heavily. I will wire for the reinforcements from Fort Concho. Eliza's heart hammered so hard she thought they must hear it through the wall. A massacre. They were planning a massacre, and they were using her return as the catalyst. She had to warn him. She waited until the voices faded, then limped as fast as she could toward the edge of town. Her legs screamed in protest, but she ignored it. She made her way to the laundry grounds, a flat area near the creek where the washwomen hung sheets to dry. Beyond it lay the foothills. It was dark now, the moon obscured by clouds. Eliza gathered a small pile of dry sagebrush and twigs. Ashen Dove had taught her the signals: a large fire for help, a smoky fire for concealment, and 3 small, quick flashes for danger. She struck a match, shielding the flame with her skirt. She lit the brush, let it flare up, then smothered it with dirt. She did it again, and a third time. Then she waited. The minutes stretched into an hour. The crickets chirped in the darkness. Had he seen it? Was he even watching? You play with fire, Eliza Hart. She spun around. Wolf Shadow detached himself from the darkness between 2 hanging bedsheets. He was so silent she hadn't heard a twig snap. He was close, dangerously close. They are coming, she whispered, the words rushing out. Briggs has convinced the captain. 500 soldiers. Reinforcements from Fort Concho. They plan to attack in 3 days. Dawn. Wolf Shadow's face was a mask of stone in the shadows, but his eyes glittered. He moves quickly. He told Reynolds your people are stockpiling stolen rifles. He planted evidence. Eliza reached out, gripping his forearm. His skin was cool from the night air. You have to move the camp. Tonight. Go deep into the mountains where wagons cannot follow. If we run, we prove his lie, Wolf Shadow said. If we run, we starve in the high peaks. If you stay, you die, Eliza pleaded. This isn't a skirmish. Wolf Shadow, it is extermination. He looked down at her, and the hardness in his face fractured. He raised his hand, his fingers grazing her cheekbone, tracing the line of her jaw. The touch was feather-light, a startling contrast to the violence of his words. You came back to a den of snakes, he murmured, and yet you come out here, in the dark, to save us. I am not saving us, Eliza said, her voice trembling. I am saving you. He stepped closer, closing the small gap between them. His body blocked out the wind. He was heat and solid earth. 3 days, he whispered. He leaned down. Eliza tilted her head back, her pulse racing in her throat. He did not kiss her mouth immediately. He pressed his lips to her forehead, a gesture of reverence that made her knees weak. Then, his mouth slid down her temple, over her cheekbone, finding the corner of her lips. When he finally kissed her, it was short, hard, and desperate. It tasted of danger. It was not a polite, wet peck like Thomas's. It was a claim. It was a promise made in the face of death. Eliza gasped against his mouth, her hands clutching the front of his buckskin shirt. For a moment, her bad leg, her shame, the town, the railroad, it all vanished. There was only this man and the fire in her blood. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers. His breathing was ragged. If we survive this, he growled low in his throat. We will speak of this again, in the sunlight, not in the shadows. We will survive, Eliza said fiercely. Go, he commanded, stepping back into the dark. Do not let them see you. Be the shadow now. He vanished as quickly as he had come. Eliza stood alone by the laundry lines, her lips still tingling, her heart beating a war drum. She touched her mouth. She turned back toward the lights of Dusty Hollow. The fear was gone. In its place was a cold, sharp clarity. She would not just warn the Comanche. Warning them was not enough. Briggs would just chase them to the next canyon. To stop this, she had to cut the head off the snake. She had to destroy Harlan Briggs. She adjusted her skirt, gripped her stick, and began the long walk back to the boarding house. She had 3 days, and, for the first time in her life, Eliza Hart was ready to fight dirty. The dawn broke over Dusty Hollow, not with the promise of a new day, but with the metallic taste of impending violence. The sky was a bruised purple, bleeding into a harsh, unforgiving orange at the horizon. Eliza Hart stood in the shadows of the livery stable, her breath misting faintly in the chill morning air. Her hands trembled, not from cold, but from the adrenaline that had been coursing through her veins since she had stolen the ledger from Harlan Briggs's office 3 hours ago. It had been a reckless, terrifying act slipping through the back window while the town slept, guided only by the moonlight and a desperation that tasted like ash. She tightened the cinch on the saddle of the mare she had borrowed from the stable. Her right leg, the bad one, throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a reminder of the miles she had walked the night before. But today, pain was a luxury she could not afford. She reached down and took a strip of leather she had cut from an old rein. With swift, jerky movements, she bound her right boot to the stirrup. "You cannot fall," she whispered to herself. "If you ride to stay." "Eliza." She froze. Stepping out from behind a stack of hay bales was Luke. Her brother looked younger than his 18 years in the dim light, his eyes wide and fearful, but his jaw was set with a stubbornness that mirrored her own. "Go back to bed, Luke," she hissed, checking the girth strap one last time. "I saw you leave the boarding house," Luke said, stepping closer. He saw the rifle scabbard attached to the saddle empty, for she had no weapon and the leather strap binding her foot. "You are going to the canyon. You are going to stop them. They are marching into a slaughter. Luke, Briggs convinced the captain. If I do not go, if you go, you will get killed." Luke's voice cracked. "Let me go. I can ride faster. I am not—" He stopped, his eyes darting to her leg. "You are not crippled," Eliza finished for him, her voice sharp. She grabbed his shoulders. "This is not a race. Luke, this is a witnessing. I have the proof." She patted the heavy leather-bound book tucked inside her saddlebag. "But I need you to stay here. If I do not come back, you take this story to the marshals in Austin. Do you understand?" Luke shook his head violently. "No, I am not staying behind while my sister rides into a war." Before she could argue, the sound of bugles cut through the air. The heavy, rhythmic thud of marching boots echoed from Main Street. Captain Reynolds was moving out. "It is starting," Eliza said. She hauled herself up onto the horse, grimacing as her bad leg took the weight before settling into the saddle. "Stay safe, Luke!" She kicked the mare's flanks and galloped out the back exit, skirting the edge of town to get ahead of the column. She did not look back. If she had, she would have seen Luke running for his own horse, tears streaming down his face, refusing to be left behind again. The Red Rock Canyon was a cathedral of stone, towering and silent, but today, the silence was about to be shattered. Harlan Briggs sat atop his massive bay gelding, looking at the canyon entrance with the hunger of a wolf staring at a trapped lamb. Beside him, Captain Reynolds looked less eager. The captain's uniform was impeccable, but his face was gray. Behind them, 50 soldiers stood in formation, rifles at the ready. Further back, a mob of men from Dusty Hollow hired guns. Cattle hands and frightened citizens waited with a chaotic mix of shotguns and pistols. They had come to see a show. Briggs had promised them justice. He had promised them that the Comanche threat would be ended before lunch. "They are digging in," Briggs said, pointing his riding crop toward the narrow mouth of the canyon. "See, they refuse to surrender." Reynolds squinted against the rising sun. "I see 5 men, Mr. Briggs, standing in the open. That does not look like an ambush. It looks like a parley." Wolf Shadow stood at the forefront of the small group of Comanche warriors. He had sent the women, children, and elders deep into the labyrinth of the upper cliffs during the night, just as Eliza had begged him to. He had stayed behind with only 4 of his best men to hold the entrance. To buy time, he wore no war paint today. He stood tall, his arms crossed over his chest, a rifle held loosely in one hand, barrel pointing at the ground. He looked like a king standing before a pack of scavenging dogs. We have no quarrel with the army. Wolf Shadow's voice carried across the distance, deep and resonant. We are on our treaty land. You are on company land, Briggs shouted back, his face flushing red. And you are hoarding stolen weapons. Surrender them, or we will take them from your cold, dead hands. We have no stolen weapons, Wolf Shadow replied, calm. Only the ones we bought to protect our families from your hired killers. Lies. Briggs turned to Reynolds. You hear him. Captain, he denies it. He mocks the authority of the United States. Order the fire. Sweep them out. Reynolds hesitated. He looked at the 5 men standing against 50. I need to see the weapons. Briggs, I cannot order a volley on 5 men standing under a flag of truce without proof. The proof is in their blood, Briggs snarled. He looked over his shoulder at Dutch, his foreman, who was positioned behind a rock with a long-range Sharps rifle. Briggs gave a subtle nod. The tension stretched tight as a bowstring. A hawk screeched high above, and then the thunder of hooves broke the standoff. Stop in the name of God! Stop! Every head turned. Racing down the scree slope from the eastern ridge was a lone rider. The horse was sliding, nearly falling, kicking up clouds of red dust. The rider was a woman, her hair flying loose, her dress hiked up to reveal buckskin leggings. It is the Heart Girl, a soldier muttered. Eliza pulled on the reins with all her strength, forcing the mare to skid to a halt directly between the line of soldiers and the Comanche warriors. The horse danced nervously, terrified by the smell of gun oil and fear. Eliza gasped for breath, her chest heaving. Her leg, tied to the stirrup, felt like it was on fire, the bones screaming from the abuse of the ride. But she sat straight. She looked from Reynolds to Briggs. "Do not fire," she shouted, her voice raw. "There are no stolen rifles. It is a lie." Eliza, Thomas Avery, who had been hiding near the rear of the civilian mob, stepped forward. "Get out of the way! You are mad!" Briggs spurred his horse forward, his face twisting into a mask of rage. "She is bewitched!" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Look at her, dressed like a savage. The Stockholm Syndrome has rotted her brain. She is protecting her lovers. Get her out of there." "I am protecting the truth," Eliza screamed back. She fumbled with her saddlebag, her fingers shaking, and pulled out the heavy black ledger. She held it up high, like a shield. "I have the payroll. Captain Reynolds," she shouted, turning the book toward the officer. "Here, look at the dates. The attack on the supply wagon. Briggs paid Dutch and 3 other men a bonus of $50 each on the very next day. It is listed as special services." She reached into her bodice and pulled out a handful of crumpled letters. And here, letters to the surveyor in St. Louis. Briggs promised the land was clear of hostiles 2 months ago. He needed an Indian war to void the treaty so he could lay his track. He hired men to dress as Comanche and raid the outlying farms. A murmur rippled through the soldiers. Captain Reynolds stared at the book in her hand. His face hardened. "Bring that to me, Miss Hart." Reynolds ordered. "Do not listen to her," Briggs roared. Panic was starting to crack his voice. "She is a hysterical cripple. She stole my private property. She is lying to save that. That animal behind her." Briggs pointed a shaking finger at Wolf Shadow. Eliza turned her horse to face the soldiers, exposing her back to Wolf Shadow. She trusted him. She did not trust the man who had sat at a dinner table and planned a genocide over roast beef. "I saw the boots," Eliza shouted to the soldiers. "When the wagon was attacked, the man who tried to drag me away was wearing cavalry-issue boots. It was Dutch. Ask him to show you his boots." 50 pairs of eyes shifted to where Dutch was crouching. The foreman looked around, sweat beading on his forehead. He instinctively tried to pull his feet under him. "That is enough," Briggs screamed. He realized the tide was turning. The narrative he had carefully constructed was unraveling because of one woman who refused to stay broken. Briggs looked at Dutch and gave a frantic, cutting motion with his hand. "Kill him! Kill the Indian! Start the war!" Dutch raised his rifle. He did not aim at Reynolds. He aimed past Eliza, directly at the chest of Wolf Shadow. Eliza saw the movement. She saw the sun glint off the barrel. She saw the tightening of Dutch's finger. She did not think. She did not calculate. There was no time to untie her leg. There was no time to shout. She slammed her heels into the mare's ribs and yanked the reins to the left. The horse lunged. Bang! The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Eliza felt a sensation like being struck by a sledgehammer. It was not in her chest. It was lower. Her left leg, her good leg, exploded in a spray of red mist. The impact threw her sideways. If her right foot had not been tied to the stirrup, she would have flown off. Instead, she hung off the side of the panic-stricken horse, screaming in agony as the animal reared. "Eliza!" The scream came from two throats at once, Luke, who had just arrived at the ridge, and Wolf Shadow. Wolf Shadow moved faster than thought. He raised his rifle. He had a clear shot at Briggs. He could end the man who had hunted his people. He could take his revenge for the winter village, for his wife, for the years of hunger. The rage in his blood demanded it. But then he saw Eliza. She was dangling from the saddle, blood pouring from her thigh, her face white with shock. The soldiers were raising their rifles, panic taking over. If Wolf Shadow fired now, the soldiers would return fire. A barrage of 50 rifles would tear through the air. Eliza was in the crossfire. Wolf Shadow looked at Briggs, the architect of his pain. Then he looked at Eliza, the woman who had ridden into hell for him. "I need a partner, not a racer." He lowered his rifle. "Hold fire!" Wolf Shadow roared in Comanche. Then, in English, "Do not shoot." He dropped his weapon to the dirt and raised his empty hands, stepping out fully into the open, making himself a target to draw the soldiers' eyes away from the woman on the horse. The soldiers, seeing the savage drop his gun despite being under attack, froze. Their fingers hovered on the triggers. "Cease fire!" Captain Reynolds bellowed, breaking the spell. "Damn it! Hold your fire!" The captain spurred his horse forward, placing himself between his men and Dutch. He drew his saber. "Arrest that man!" Reynolds shouted, pointing at Dutch. "And arrest Harlan Briggs." "You cannot do this!" Briggs shrieked, his horse spinning as two sergeants grabbed his reins. "I own this town, I own you. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and incitement of war," Reynolds said, his voice cold as ice. He looked down at the ledger that had fallen from Eliza's hand into the dust. "And I suspect this book will tell me exactly how much you thought I was worth." Dutch tried to run, scrambling up the rocks, but a volley of warning shots from the soldiers pinned him down. He threw his rifle away, surrendering. The battle was over before it had begun. But the cost was paid in blood. Wolf Shadow did not wait for permission. He ran across the open ground. He reached Eliza just as her grip on the saddle horn failed. He caught her. He cut the leather strap binding her right foot with his knife and pulled her free from the horse. He sank to his knees in the dust, cradling her against his chest. "Eliza!" he choked out. She was conscious, but her eyes were glassy. The bullet had passed through the meat of her left thigh. It was a clean shot, missing the artery, but the blood was bright and hot. Eliza gasped, her teeth chattering. I stood up." "You did," Wolf Shadow whispered fiercely. He pressed his hand over the wound, applying pressure. "You stood taller than any of them." She looked up at him, her vision swimming. "My good leg," she murmured, a faint, hysterical laugh bubbling up in her chest. Now I have a matching set." "Hush," he said, brushing the hair from her sweating forehead. Around them, the chaos was settling. The soldiers were securing Briggs and Dutch. The townspeople were staring in stunned silence. Luke was running down the slope, sliding and falling in his haste to reach his sister. But in the center of the valley, there was only the two of them. Wolf Shadow looked up. He looked at Captain Reynolds. He looked at Thomas Avery, who stood pale and shaking at the edge of the crowd. He looked at the people of Dusty Hollow. He did not hide. He did not cower. He held the white woman in his arms, her blood soaking into his buckskin shirt, and he dared anyone to challenge him. "Doctor," Wolf Shadow shouted, his voice cracking with a desperation he had never shown in battle. "We need a doctor." Captain Reynolds nodded to his field surgeon. "Help her, now!" As the surgeon rushed forward with his bag, Eliza felt the darkness closing in, but she did not feel fear. She felt the strong, steady beat of Wolf Shadow's heart against her ear. She felt his arms, solid as the earth, holding her together when she was falling apart. She had made her choice. She had chosen her side. And as the world faded to black, she knew that for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged. The smell of carbolic acid and stale blood was the first thing that greeted Eliza's heart when she drifted back to the surface of the living. It was a sharp, chemical scent that warred with the earthy aroma of cured buffalo hide and burning cedar. She was lying on a cot in a large canvas tent pitched on the flat ground near the river, a neutral zone established between the town of Dusty Hollow and the Comanche encampment. Her left leg, the one that had been her strong anchor for the last 8 years, was immobilized in a heavy plaster cast. Her right leg, the old enemy, ached in sympathy. "She is awake," a voice said. Eliza turned her head, the movement making the world spin sickeningly. The army doctor, a man with tired eyes and a beard stained with tobacco, was wiping his hands on a rag, standing near the entrance of the tent, motionless as a statue carved from obsidian, was Wolf Shadow. "Water," Eliza croaked. Wolf Shadow moved before the doctor could. He stepped forward, lifted a tin cup from a side table, and held it to her lips. The water was cool and tasted of the river. Eliza drank greedily, some of it spilling down her chin. Wolf Shadow wiped it away with his thumb, his touch lingering for a second against her skin. "The fever has broken," the doctor said, stepping closer. He looked at Wolf Shadow with a mixture of fear and grudging respect, then turned his attention to Eliza. "Miss Hart, you have been unconscious for 4 days. The infection was stubborn." "My leg," Eliza whispered. The doctor pulled up a stool and sat down. He looked grave. "The bullet passed through the quadriceps muscle of your left thigh. It missed the femoral artery by less than an inch, which is the only reason you are not currently being measured for a pine box. However, the muscle damage is severe." Eliza stared at the canvas ceiling. She knew what was coming. She had heard this tone before, 8 years ago in Pennsylvania. "You will walk again." "Eliza," the doctor said, using her first name with a paternal pity that made her stomach turn. "But the left leg will now be as stiff as the right one is short. You will need a cane, perhaps 2, for the rest of your life. Your gait will be significantly impaired." Silence filled the tent. Outside, the wind whipped against the canvas. In the world of the frontier, a woman's value was often measured by her utility. She needed to be able to churn butter, carry water, dance at weddings, and bear children without complication. A woman who could barely walk was a burden. A woman with 2 ruined legs was a tragedy to be pitied, a charity case to be hidden away in a back room. "I see," Eliza said. Her voice did not tremble. She felt a strange, cold numbness settling over her. "Thank you, doctor." The doctor sighed, patted her hand, and stood up. "I will leave you to rest. The captain wants a statement when you are up to it, but there is no rush." He left the tent. Eliza closed her eyes. Tears leaked out from the corners, hot and stinging. She was 24 years old, and she was effectively an invalid. The dream of a normal life, which she had already compromised so heavily, was now dead and buried. She felt the mattress depress. Wolf Shadow sat down on the edge of the cot. He did not speak. He simply took her hand, her left hand, the one that wore no ring, and held it between his 2 large, rough palms. "They think I am broken," Eliza whispered, not opening her eyes. "They look at the shell," Wolf Shadow replied. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "I look at the fire. The fire is dim, but it is not out. I cannot walk. Wolf Shadow, I will be a cripple twice over, a burden. You rode a horse between 2 armies," he said. "You stood in the face of 50 rifles. You saved my life. You saved the lives of my men. Do you think I care how fast you can walk to the river?" Eliza opened her eyes. He was looking at her with an intensity that burned. "But I will be slow," she insisted. "I will be painful to look at." Wolf Shadow squeezed her hand. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Then we will walk slow," he said. "The mountains are not going anywhere." 3 weeks later, the cast came off. The rehabilitation began not in a hospital, but on the rocky ground beside the river. Wolf Shadow did not let her lie in bed. He made her stand. He whittled 2 sturdy crutches from ash wood, wrapped the tops in soft deer hide, and handed them to her. "Walk," he commanded. It was agony. The muscles in her left leg had atrophied, and the scar tissue pulled tight like a burning wire with every movement. Her right leg, forced to bear the weight it was never designed for, screamed in protest. Eliza took a step. Her knees buckled. She fell hard into the red dust. She lay there, gasping, waiting for him to pick her up. He did not. He stood 3 feet away, watching her. "Get up," he said. "I cannot," she sobbed, hitting the ground with her fist. "It hurts too much. Pain is a message," Wolf Shadow said impassively. "It tells you are still alive. Get up, Eliza." She looked at him with hatred. How could he be so cruel? But then she saw his hands. They were clenched into fists at his sides, the knuckles white. He wanted to help her. Every instinct in him was screaming to lift her up. But he knew that if he carried her now, she would never learn to carry herself. Gritting her teeth, Eliza grabbed the crutches. She leveraged her weight. She pushed. She screamed a raw, guttural sound of effort. She stood. She took another step, then another. She swayed, sweat pouring down her face, her dress clinging to her body. Wolf Shadow stepped in then. He moved behind her, his hands hovering at her waist but not touching. A safety net of warmth. "Good," he murmured in her ear. "Find the balance. The earth is uneven, but you are the anchor." "I feel like a newborn foal," she panted. "Wobbly and useless." "A foal learns to run in an hour," he said. "You have had to learn twice. That makes you twice as strong." They walked 10 yards. It took 5 minutes. When they stopped, Eliza leaned back against his chest, exhausted. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her upright, taking her weight. "I limp when I walk," she whispered, repeating the words she had said to him weeks ago in the canyon. "I know," Wolf Shadow replied, resting his chin on the top of her head. "I told you then, and I tell you now, I do not need a racer. I need a partner who will finish the journey, even if it takes until the stars die." The tenderness in his voice broke something open inside her, the shame of her disability, which had been a heavy cloak she wore for 8 years, began to unravel. She was not perfect. She was scarred, lopsided, and slow, but she was standing in the arms of a warrior who saw her scars as medals of honor. While Eliza fought her battle with gravity, the town of Dusty Hollow fought its own battle with the truth. Harlan Briggs was not a man who went down quietly, but the ledger Eliza had stolen was damning. It contained dates, payments, and letters that implicated him in federal fraud, conspiracy to incite war, and the theft of government property. Captain Reynolds, looking to salvage his own career and conscience, had Briggs shackled and placed in a wagon bound for the federal court in Austin. The mighty Baron of Dusty Hollow was dragged out of his mansion in cuffs, shouting threats that no one listened to anymore. The news spread like wildfire. The Comanche raids had been a lie. The fear that had gripped the town had been manufactured for profit. The town split down the middle. One faction, mostly the wealthy merchants and the church elders, hated Eliza. To them, she was a traitor. She was the woman who had sided with the savages against her own kind, who had humiliated a prominent white man, who had ruined the railroad deal that would have made them all rich. They called her Indian Lover and spat on the ground when her name was mentioned. The other faction, the poor farmers, the ranch hands who had been tired of Briggs's tyranny, and the soldiers saw things differently. They saw a woman who had stopped a massacre, but Eliza saw none of this. She stayed in the tent by the river, protected by Wolf Shadow's presence, until Thomas Avery came. He arrived at twilight, riding a nondescript horse, wearing a hat pulled low to obscure his face. He did not come to the main entrance of the tent, but waited by the riverbank where Eliza sat soaking her swollen feet in the cold water. "Eliza," he said softly. Eliza turned. Thomas looked diminished. Without Briggs's shadow to stand in, he seemed smaller, his handsome face marred by anxiety. "Thomas," she said. She did not stand. She did not reach for her crutches. "I heard you were walking," he said, looking at the crutches lying on the grass. "That is good news. What do you want?" Thomas took off his hat and turned it in his hands. "I wanted to see if you were reasonable. The trial is starting in Austin. If you testify, if you tell them about the dinner, about what father, about what Mr. Briggs said, it will destroy everything. The company, the ranch, my inheritance. The truth destroys only lies. Thomas." He stepped closer, his voice taking on a pleading, conspiratorial tone. "Listen to me, Eliza. You cannot come back to town. You know that. They hate you. You are a pariah. No decent man will look at you now. A cripple who ran off with a Comanche. You are ruined." Eliza looked at the water flowing over her scarred feet. "I suppose I am. But I can help," Thomas said quickly. "I still care for you, Eliza. I do. I have a small property in the North County. A cottage. It is secluded. You could live there. I would pay for a nurse. I would visit you. You would be comfortable, safe. No one would have to know." Eliza looked up at him, realizing slowly what he was offering. He was offering to make her his mistress, his kept woman, hidden away like a shameful secret, living on his charity, while he likely married some pristine, whole debutante in town. He thought he was being generous. He thought he was saving her. Eliza reached for her crutches. She planted them in the mud and hauled herself up. It was a slow, clumsy process. Thomas moved to help her, but she held up a hand. "Do not touch me," she said. She stood fully upright, swaying slightly, but looking him in the eye. "You offer me a cage and call it a home," she said, her voice steady. "You offer me shame and call it love. I am offering you survival," Thomas hissed. "Look at you, Eliza. You can barely stand. Who else will take you that savage? Do you think he will stay when the winter comes? Do you think you can survive living in a dirt-floor teepee with legs like that?" "I do not know if I will survive," Eliza said. "But I know this. I would rather limp over sharp rocks beside a man who respects me than walk on smooth floors beside a man who is always looking down at my feet." She took a step toward him, forcing him to give ground. "Go home, Thomas. Save your inheritance, but do not ever presume to save me again." Thomas stared at her, his face flushing red with humiliation. He slammed his hat back on his head. "You will regret this," he spat. "When you are starving in the snow, you will regret this." He turned and marched back to his horse. Eliza watched him go. She felt a profound lightness. The last thread binding her to Dusty Hollow had been cut. The next morning, Luke arrived. He brought a pack horse loaded with flour, sugar, and coffee. He looked older, his face set with a new maturity. "I am going with you," Luke announced as he dumped the supplies by the fire. Eliza sat on a log, rubbing her aching thigh. "No, you are not. You have a job at the livery. You have a girl you like at the bakery. I saw the way you look at her." Luke blushed, but shook his head. "I cannot let you go into the mountains alone. You need help, and it is my fault." Eliza stopped rubbing her leg. "What is your fault?" "Your legs," Luke said, his voice cracking. Tears welled up in his eyes. "The accident, 8 years ago. You jumped to save me. If I had not been so stupid, if I had not frozen, you would be whole. You would be a teacher. You would be married to a rich man. I ruined your life. Eliza." Eliza reached out and grabbed his hand, pulling him down to sit beside her. "Listen to me, Luke Hart," she said fiercely. "Look at me." He looked up, misery etched on his face. "Do you see this?" She gestured to the landscape, the towering red cliffs, the endless sky, and Wolf Shadow standing in the distance, watching the perimeter. "Do you see who I am now?" "You're hurt," Luke whispered. "I am free," Eliza said. "Yes, the accident took my walk. It took my easy life, but it also took me here. If I had not fallen, I would have stayed in Pennsylvania. I would have married a boring clerk. I would have lived a small, safe life, and I never would have known how strong I am. I never would have met him." She glanced at Wolf Shadow. "I do not regret saving you, Luke, and I do not regret the fall. It broke my bone, but it set my spirit straight. You do not owe me a debt. You gave me a destiny." Luke stared at her, the guilt of 8 years slowly beginning to lift from his shoulders. He hugged her then, burying his face in her neck. "I will stay in town," he said, pulling back and wiping his nose. "I will be your voice there. I will tell the truth about what happened." "That is a brave thing to do," Eliza said, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and crimson. Wolf Shadow stood by the horses. He was packing the last of the supplies. He moved slowly, his brow furrowed. Ashen Dove approached him. She placed a withered hand on his arm. "Your heart is heavy, my son," she said in the Comanche tongue. "I am taking a woman who cannot run into a life that requires running." Wolf Shadow replied quietly. "Am I selfish?" The boy offered to take her back. She could have lived in a house with walls. "Walls keep the wind out," Ashen Dove said. "But they also keep the spirit in. You look at her legs and you worry, but you do not look at her eyes." Wolf Shadow looked over at Eliza, who was saying goodbye to Luke. She was leaning on her crutches, laughing at something her brother said. The sound was clear and bright. "The woman understands the pain of the earth," Ashen Dove continued. "She has carried pain for many winters. She is not brittle. Wolf Shadow. She has forged iron. She will travel farther with you on broken legs than any whole woman who fears the dark." Wolf Shadow nodded slowly. "I am afraid I will fail her." "Then do not fail her," Ashen Dove said simply. "Be her staff, and let her be your heart." Eliza limped over to the horses. Luke had ridden away, a small figure disappearing into the dusk. The camp was struck. The few Comanche warriors who had stayed were already mounted, waiting. Eliza stood at the edge of the ridge, looking down at Dusty Hollow one last time. The lights of the town were flickering on. It looked warm. It looked safe. It looked like a place where everyone knew the rules and everyone stayed in their lines. Wolf Shadow came to stand beside her. He brought her horse a gentle, sturdy mare with a special saddle he had modified with a deeper seat and straps to secure her legs. He did not help her up immediately. He stood beside her, looking down at the town. "The snow will come in 2 moons," he said. "The winters are hard. There is no doctor. There is no silk." "I have had enough silk," Eliza said. "They will hunt us, sometimes," he warned. "We will always be watching the horizon. It is not a peaceful life." "I have had peace," Eliza said. "It tasted like dust." Wolf Shadow turned to face her. He framed her face with his hands. "Are you sure?" "Eliza, once we cross this ridge, there is no going back to that world." Eliza looked at him. She looked at the man who had caught her when she fell, who had stood between her and a firing squad, who had sat in a tent for 3 weeks holding her hand while she burned with fever. She leaned her weight on her crutches and looked him in the eye. "I am tired of asking permission to exist," she said. "I am tired of apologizing for the space I take up. I choose the wind, Wolf Shadow. I choose the rocks, and I choose you." He smiled, then a rare, brilliant smile that transformed his face. He leaned down and kissed her, deep and slow, sealing the covenant between them. "Then let us go," he whispered against her lips. He lifted her onto the horse, securing her bad legs with a gentleness that belied his strength. He mounted his own paint horse. They turned their backs on Dusty Hollow. They turned their backs on the railroad, the courtrooms, and the polite society that had no place for a crippled woman and a renegade warrior. Eliza Hart did not look back. She adjusted her grip on the reins, felt the steady rhythm of the horse beneath her, and rode toward the darkening mountains. She was limping into the unknown, but for the first time in her life, she was flying. 2 winters had passed since the day the guns fell silent in the Red Rock Canyon. The seasons in the territory were harsh teachers. The summer sun baked the earth until it cracked like old pottery, and the winter winds swept down from the north with teeth of ice. But high on the ridge, nestled in a sheltered fold of the land where the pine forest met the open stone. A new kind of root had taken hold. It was a homestead, though it looked like nothing found in the architectural books of the East, nor the traditions of the plains. There was a cabin built of sturdy pine logs, chinked with river clay, standing shoulder to shoulder with a large, beautifully painted buffalo hide teepee. Smoke curled from the stone chimney of the cabin and the smoke hole of the lodge, twisting together in the morning air like two breaths becoming one. Eliza Hart sat on a high-backed chair carved from oak, positioned on the flat porch of the cabin. Her left leg was stiff, extended straight out in front of her. Her right leg was bent, the foot resting on a small stool. A pair of heavy crutches leaned against the wall within easy reach. "Again," she said, her voice firm but warm. "The letter A is like the mountain peak, sharp at the top." Sitting cross-legged in the dirt before her were 12 children. 7 of them were Comanche, with hair like raven wings and eyes that missed nothing. 3 were the children of mixed blood, the half-breeds that the world usually discarded. And 2 miraculously were white children from Dusty Hollow, boys whose curiosity had outweighed their parents' prejudices. A young Comanche boy, Little Hawk, held up a piece of slate. He had drawn a perfect A. "Good," Eliza nodded. "Now, B is the buffalo, big chest, big belly." The children giggled. This was Eliza's school. There were no walls, no bell, and no tuition. The currency here was respect. She taught them to read the English words that would one day try to trick them in treaties. She taught them the mathematics of trade so they would not be cheated by merchants. And in return, they taught her. They taught her the names of the herbs that stopped bleeding, the signs of a coming storm, and the patience of the spider weaving its web. A shadow fell across the porch. Eliza looked up to see Wolf's shadow coming from the corral. He was leading a spotted pony, checking its hooves. He wore a mixture of buckskin and denim now, a shirt of blue cotton cloth tucked into leather leggings. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, etched by the sun and the constant vigilance of a man protecting a fragile peace. He tied the pony to the rail and walked up the steps. He moved with the silence of a ghost, a stark contrast to the heavy, rhythmic thump drag that announced Eliza's presence anywhere she went. "The boy, Little Hawk, has a quick mind," Wolf Shadow observed, leaning against the porch post. "He does," Eliza agreed, wiping chalk dust from her fingers. "He asked me yesterday why the white men write on paper when the rocks last longer. I did not have an answer." Wolf Shadow smiled, a slow expression that reached his eyes. "Paper burns. Rocks remember. The boy is wise." He looked down at the dusty yard where the children were packing up their slates. "We have visitors coming up the trail. A wagon." Eliza stiffened instinctively. The war was over, but the peace was a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark lake. There were still men in Texas who believed the only good Indian was a dead one, and women who believed a white woman living with a Comanche was a sin against God. "Soldiers?" she asked. "No," Wolf Shadow said, resting his hand briefly on her shoulder. "Friends." The wagon creaked up the steep incline, the horses blowing hard. At the reins sat Luke, Eliza's brother. He had filled out in the last 2 years. His shoulders were broad, and he handled the team with a confidence he had lacked before. Beside him sat a man with gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard, wearing a civilian suit that looked slightly too tight for his military bearing. It was former Captain Reynolds. "Afternoon, sister," Luke called out, waving his hat. "Brought the flour you asked for, and some peppermint sticks for the little ones. You will rot their teeth." "Luke," Eliza scolded gently as the wagon came to a halt, but she was smiling. Reynolds climbed down stiffly. He took off his hat and nodded to Wolf Shadow. It was a gesture of equality that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago. "Mr. Shadow," Reynolds said. "Captain," Wolf Shadow replied. "The coffee is on the fire." They sat around the large wooden table outside the cabin. It was a strange gathering, a crippled seamstress, a Comanche warrior, a retired Union officer, and a livery boy. They broke bread and ate dried venison. "The town is changing," Reynolds said, blowing on his hot coffee. "The railroad finally came through. 10 miles south. Dusty Hollow missed the boom. Briggs's old mansion is being turned into a hotel for travelers." "And Briggs?" Eliza asked. She did not feel fear at the name anymore, only a distant curiosity. "Still in federal prison in Leavenworth," Reynolds said with a grim satisfaction. "Labor camp. I hear he spends his days breaking rocks, fitting work for a man who tried to break the world." Luke leaned forward. "But the talk, Eliza, it has changed. They do not call you a traitor anymore. Not to your face, anyway. The new preacher, Reverend Hale, he used you in his sermon last Sunday." Eliza raised an eyebrow. "As a cautionary tale about the dangers of the wilderness, I assume." "No," Luke grinned. "He talked about the Samaritan. He said true charity does not look at the color of the skin or the cut of the clothes. He said the bravest person this town ever produced was the woman who rode a horse with a broken leg to stop a war." Eliza looked down at her coffee cup. "They turn us into stories, so they do not have to deal with us as people." "Maybe," Wolf Shadow said, his voice deep. "But a good story is a shield. If they think we are legends, they are less likely to come up here and shoot our dogs." Reynolds chuckled. "There is truth in that, but I came for another reason. The Army. My replacement at the fort. They are looking for scouts. Men who know the land but can speak English. Honest men." He looked at Wolf Shadow. "They pay in gold, and they offer federal protection for the families of the scouts." The offer hung in the air. It was a path to legitimacy, a way to be accepted. Wolf Shadow looked at the distant horizon, then at Eliza's crutches leaning against the table. "I am done with the Army's wars," Wolf Shadow said quietly. "I have a different duty now. I guard this ridge, I guard the school. My war is keeping the peace in this one small circle." Reynolds nodded, not offended. "I told them you would say that, but I had to ask." When the visitors left, leaving behind sacks of flour, salt, and news from the outside world, the sun was beginning to dip below the peaks. The light turned the red rocks into pillars of fire. That evening, the air grew cold. Eliza and Wolf Shadow sat on the porch. The children had returned to the teepee or their own families in the hidden valley below. It was just the two of them. Eliza rubbed her left thigh. The damp air made the scar tissue ache with a dull, grinding toothache pain. She tried to hide it, but Wolf Shadow knew her better than she knew herself. He stood up from his chair and knelt before her. He did not ask permission. He lifted her left leg and placed it gently in his lap. His large, warm hands began to work the muscle, finding the knots of tension and kneading them out with a practiced, rhythmic pressure. "You stood too long today," he murmured. The children were restless. Eliza sighed, leaning her head back against the chair and closing her eyes. The relief was instantaneous. "Little Hawk tried to climb the roof. He has a warrior's spirit." "He has a monkey's spirit," Eliza corrected. "I had to threaten him with the cane." Wolf Shadow chuckled low in his throat. He looked up at her, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners. "You are a terrifying woman, Eliza Hart. I have faced grizzly bears that were less strict than you." "Someone has to teach them manners," she said, opening one eye to look at him. "Or they will grow up to be wild things like you." "And would that be so terrible?" He slid his hand down to her ankle, his touch becoming slower, more deliberate. It was a touch of intimacy that went beyond simple caretaking. It was the touch of a man who knew every scar, every broken bone, every jagged edge of her, and loved them not in spite of the damage, but because of the story they told. "No," Eliza whispered, her voice softening. "It would not be terrible at all." He leaned forward and kissed the scar on her knee. It was a gesture of worship. "You are beautiful," he said. "I am a wreck," she replied, but there was no bite in the words. "You are the strongest thing on this mountain." They sat there as the stars began to poke through the indigo canvas of the sky. They were two outcasts, a woman broken by gravity, and a man broken by history, who had built a fortress out of their shattered pieces. Down in Dusty Hollow, the saloon was busy. The piano player was hammering out a jaunty tune, and the air was thick with smoke and the smell of cheap whiskey. At a corner table, an old man with a face like a dried apple sat nursing a beer. It was Barnaby, the mail carrier who rode the high passes. A group of Greenhorn's new settlers from the east were listening to him, their eyes wide. "I saw them," Barnaby said, his voice raspy. "Just last week, up on the Devil's Ridge." "Saw who?" a young man asked. "The limping lady in the shadow," Barnaby whispered. "I was coming down the switchback, and the moon was full. I saw a fire burning on the edge of the cliff, and there they were." He took a sip of beer for dramatic effect. "They were dancing. No music. Mind you, just the wind. The man, he is big, moves like a panther, and the woman, she has got a hitch in her step that you can see from a mile away. Drag and step, drag and step. Dancing," the young man scoffed. "With a bad leg." "That is just it." Barnaby leaned in. "She wasn't trying to hide it. She was leaning on him, and he was moving with her, like he was the other half of her bone. They were swaying there on the edge of the world. They didn't look like white folk. They didn't look like Indians. They looked like, well, like they belonged to a tribe of two." The table went silent. "Some say she is a witch," a woman muttered. "Bewitch the savage." "Nay," Barnaby shook his head. "I have seen witches. That wasn't magic. That was something rarer. That was a woman who walked through fire and found the only man who wouldn't let her burn. High on the ridge, Eliza woke before the dawn. It was a habit from her days at the boarding house, a need to steal the quiet moments before the demands of the day began. She maneuvered herself out of the bed she shared with Wolf Shadow. He stirred but did not wake, one arm thrown out across the space where she had been. She reached for her crutches. Thump, swing, step. She moved through the cabin and out onto the porch. The air was cold and pure. The sky to the east was beginning to bleed from gray to pearl to a soft, tender pink. She walked slowly, painfully, deliberately to the edge of the cliff. Below her, the valley was still swallowed in purple shadow. Above her, the sky was opening up. She looked down at her legs. The right one, short and twisted. The left one, scarred and stiff. They were ugly by any conventional standard. They were the legs of a broken doll, but they had carried her here. She remembered Thomas Avery's voice, "Walk beautifully. Be an ornament." She remembered the pity in the doctor's eyes, significantly impaired. She smiled. It was a fierce, private smile. She was not an ornament. She was a witness. Every step she took was a testament to the fact that she had refused to die. Her limp was not a failure. It was her signature. It was the handwriting of her life on the earth. She heard the soft tread of moccasins behind her. Wolf Shadow stepped up beside her. He wrapped a heavy wool blanket around her shoulders and pulled her back against his chest. He did not try to support her weight. He knew she could stand. He just wanted to be with her. "The sun is coming," he said. "It is," she replied. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked suddenly. The town, the silk dresses, the easy walking. Eliza looked at the horizon. She thought about the paved streets of Philadelphia. She thought about the clean floors of the Briggs mansion. Then she felt the warmth of the man behind her, the callus of his hand on her waist. The vast, terrifying, beautiful freedom of the canyon. "No," she said. "I do not miss the easy walking. Easy walking goes nowhere worth going." Wolf Shadow turned her in his arms. The sun crested the mountains, flooding the world with a sudden, blinding gold. It lit up his face, revealing the scars of his own battles, the history written on his skin. He offered her his hand. "Shall we walk?" he asked. Eliza looked at his hand. Then she looked at the path leading down to the schoolhouse. It was rocky. It was uneven. It would hurt. She placed her hand in his. "We shall," she said. They turned toward the sun. They did not run. They did not rush. They moved with a rhythm that was entirely their own, a step, a drag, a pause, a step, a syncopated dance of survival and grace. They say in the West that speed is life. They say that the slow are left behind for the vultures. But the legend of the Red Rock Canyon tells a different story. It tells of a woman who could not run and a warrior who stopped running. It tells us that the longest journeys are not made by the swift, but by those who refuse to leave each other behind. Because, as the wind whispers through the cedar and the sage love doesn't need a racer, it needs a partner brave enough to limp through the wild and still keep walking. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope the journey of Eliza and Wolf's Shadow touched your heart as much as it did mine writing it. It is a reminder that our scars do not define our worth, and that true love is about finding someone who matches your pace. No matter how difficult the road is, I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment down below telling me where you are listening to this story from. Are you in a busy city, a quiet countryside, or maybe somewhere in between? Let's connect and share our own stories. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Hit that like button to show your support. And don't forget to press the hype button so this story can reach more people who might need to hear it. Until next time, keep walking your own path.